Hello, everyone. Greetings from Toronto. My name is Mirella, and I'm the Senior Business Development Manager for Beer at WSET. We are delighted to bring you this webinar, German Beer in a Nutshell, with the fantastic Mr. Markus Raupach, who you may have seen in our videos on how to pronounce German beer styles and glassware. Now, before we dive in, a bit about WSET. We are the world's leading provider of qualifications and courses in beer, wine, spirits, and sake, with over 55 years experience in designing and delivering education for both wine professionals and consumer enthusiasts. You can take WSET qualifications in over 70 countries through a network of more than 900 course providers. If you're interested in finding out more about embarking on a WSET journey, visit wsetglobal.com. Now, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available to watch on YouTube on the WSET Global channel. Throughout the webinar, feel free to post questions in the Q&A box. Both Markus and I will be monitoring it and replying as we go. Now, without further ado, let me introduce my friend and colleague, Markus. Markus and I met 15 years ago in Germany, and it was immediately clear to me that he has a deep knowledge and passion for beer. Markus grew up in Bamberg, which is a great beer city, and he was immersed in brewing culture from an early age. For well over a decade, Markus has been teaching beer sommelier courses, helping people discover the depth, diversity, and beauty of beer culture. He is certainly my go-to person when it comes to any advanced questions about German beer traditions and history, although his knowledge extends far beyond the beers of Germany, of course. Now, Markus is a beer judge and has published more than 60 books. He is also the only nominated WSET beer educator in Germany. In other words, he's fantastic, and we're delighted to have him host this webinar. All right, Markus, over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Mirella. I'm really delighted by your words. Thank you very much. So let's start and talk a bit about German beer in a nutshell. It's not easy to do that in about 1 hour, but we will try to make it. First, I will share my screen. And yes, so it's about the German beer in a nutshell. Let's see. Maybe first a few words about me. Mirella already said, so I'm the head of the German Beer Academy. I'm the WSET nominated educator for Germany, and she already mentioned some things about me, so I just have a quick overview. So I started 1998 with my company as a journalist. Then I got more and more into beer, had my first book in 2005 and my first competition in 2013, which is really a great experience. So I can only encourage you, if you have the chance, the ability, the possibility to get into beer judging. That's a great way to experience the world, to discover the world, and also to discover the beer world. And for me, my biggest highlight was to be knighted in Belgium some years ago and member of the Belgium Knighthood of Brewers. So this is really a great honor for me, and I'm also ambassador for the German Brewers Association. So what we are talking today. So the idea is to have the whole thing in this hour, and first start with some actual current data of the German beer market, because it's always interesting to know where we stand, where we are at the moment, and then we can look where we come from. So we will then look to the German ales first. So what about top fermenting beers, what styles are around, what's about, and all these things. And I will have a little deeper look at two of these styles, the Berliner Weisse and the Gose, because there's a lot of interest just about these beer styles around. And then we will go to the German lagers. And also, of course, we cannot cover them all, but I will show them all. And then we will go deeper into Pils, Helles, Kellerbier, and Rauchbier, which is smoke beer. And the last two are really a bit special, and it's not so easy to put them in the lager category because they are not always lagers. And there is a lot of history also behind that. And then we go into Q&A. And of course, there's a chance for you to ask questions, and I will do what I can to answer them and let you know what you are curious about. So, first of all, maybe a question to all of you, or three questions. What do you think? How much is the per capita consumption of beer in the moment in Germany? So how much beer in liters, if you are familiar with liters, in per year are the German people drinking per person? The second question is, how many breweries do you think we have? And the last question is, what do you think are the main beer styles, the three top beer styles drunk in Germany. So have a little look inside the market and just write it in the chat and I will have a look. So yes, Praise says a lot of beer, okay, and a lot of breweries. And now we are at 500 liter per year, another 500, some are around 200, Pilsner and Helles. Oh, 750 liters. So there's a lot of people are guessing we're drinking a lot. 3,500 breweries. That's also a lot. Yeah, interesting. Oh, 20 liters per year. That's not so much. All right. Perfect. Yeah, a lot of guesses. Thank you. Okay, so we will just move on to these points. The first one is the per capita consumption. So how much are we drinking? And though the last data is 88 liters per year per day. This is from last year. So now this year we are around 85. So someone in the chat, I think Julia, had it on point. So we are at 85 liters. That means we were coming from much more. So as you see, in 2000 it was 125. That not only means we are drinking less, that also means the market gets tight for the breweries, and they really have to struggle. It's not so easy to survive, and there's a lot of competition also now in the market and pressure on the market. So they really have to see. We will come back to that maybe later on. The second number was the number of breweries. And that was quite stable the last 30 years, I would say. So always around 1,200. And then we had the craft beer revolution, let's say it like this, which we also had a little in Germany. So it rose from 1,280 to 1,560. But then we had the pandemic and the aftermath, and it goes down again. So now we are around 1,450. Probably it will go back to that level around 1,250, 1,280. Just because the hype of the also US style beers, all that was quick and short and not much, and so it's gone again. So that's the number of breweries. Some was mentioning 3,500. That was France maybe 2 years ago. So, but now they are also struggling. So it's interesting to see the development in whole Europe. So let's go on to the last question: the top three beer styles. And important in that chart is the last row. Here we have the percentages of the current market. And you were right. Most of you were guessing Pilsner is the top, and it still is. It was more. It was about 60% some years ago. Now we are around 50%. So that's the major beer style dominating the country, still dominating it. If you look a little more backwards, like 50 years, then export would be the stronger one. But for now, about 40 years, Pilsner is definitely in the lead. And number two now is Helles with almost 12%. That's the new star in the beer in Germany. So it came from about 3-4% some years ago, and now it's like a rock star in terms of beer. So it's getting more and more. And number three, we have wheat beer, which was number two, but now went down. And what is really interesting, the real number three is the world of non-alcoholic beers. So in Germany, we now have around 10% of the market non-alcoholic beers, and but all of them together, not specific styles, all of them together. But that means that's an interesting share of the market and a growing share of the market. And also the breweries are now trying to get into this and try to make more non-alcoholic beers to compensate the losses they have on the other rest of the market. And it's the only market share that grows. So that's maybe similar to your countries too. Maybe if we have time, we can talk also a little bit later in the Q&A section about this recent development. But now let's go into the German beer styles, as I was already mentioning, and we are starting with the German ales. First, it's hard to make a seminar about German beer styles because both words you can really question it. Because when I start my beer education in Germany, one of my first sentences is always, "There is no German beer culture." And then the people are silent and are looking. strange and whatever. But in fact, if we look what is Germany as a country, that started in 1871. And before, it was a lot of mid-sized and small countries around what is today Germany, but also beyond. And all of them had a long tradition of hundreds of years, and they all developed their own ideas of beers. So that's why wherever you go in Germany, they drink different beers and they have a totally different idea of a beer and of a good beer. And there are a lot of bad jokes about people from Munich and Cologne and Berlin sitting together and trying to drink beer and they never come on a common ground. So that's the one thing. And the other thing is the term of beer style, because what we understand on beer styles nowadays is also quite new. So the whole idea of beer styles started with the first beer competitions, the modern ones. They started like 30 years ago. And before that, no one really cared. And still, if I go to a Franconian brewery, and they make, for example, a Keller beer, they never start looking into a book how to make a Keller beer. They just make their beer, full stop. That's it. And they are a little bit different everywhere. And so don't be too strict. Don't be too much concerned about these beer styles and rules. These are guidelines for competitions. Of course, there you need that, but not for the real beer market. There is the guideline. Are the people drinking? Are the people paying? Is it working or not? That's the main thing about beer. So if you're now talking about ales, another thing, it's also complicated because what we know of clearly ale and lager brewing in Germany started after World War II. Before, there was mostly always was a mixed fermentation. You never had a clear ale or a clear lager. So it was always the temperature in the fermentation cellar, which was in the end determining if it turns out more like a lager or more like a ale. So this is also something we have to consider. But okay, now let's go into the ale section. Anyway, we have to make some categories and we made them. And maybe looks a little bit confusing at the first moment, but we will go a little bit deeper into that. The chart is thought from left to right, from old times to modern times. And so we start on the left side, and as in every other country in the world, it started with a historical brown beer. More or less an ale, brown ale, that was what is in every country. Brewing started like this. They used the grains they had, mostly barley, but also sometimes wheat or oats or rye or whatever was available in the countries. And they used that and they just made beer. And from there, depending on the region, the area, the availability, the climate, whatever, styles or ideas of beer evolved. And so we have, for example, older styles like here you see the altbier, which is old beer, which means brewed in the old way. And in fact, it is still like a brown ale, to be honest. And on the way to altbier, to modern altbier, was another beer called beer, which is more or less a Dutch word. And it was like the step in between to what we have today in altbier. The main thing is that normally altbier is a brown dark beer, but no rule without exemption. There are some pale altbiers too. And also you have normally only barley as a source of grain in these beers. And if you brew altbier, then you also can make stronger versions like Bock versions. So that means you take more malt, so you have more alcohol in the end. And that is called Sticke. So that's the little dot here. So we go from the historical brown beer to altbier and Sticke. And that is Düsseldorf in the Rhine area. And there's another city close to that. That's Cologne, and they have their kölsch. We will talk about that later on when we're talking about pilsner. So that is the Rhine area, and then we have the Gose, which will be talking in a moment. They developed the Gose in two ways, in Goslar and in Leipzig, two cities. And we have the Berliner Weisse as another specific style we also will be talking about. Some minor ones are these historical styles, which are almost gone. So the first one is called Grätzer in German or Grodzisk in Polish. Today, it's definitely a Polish beer style. Historically, the city was always in between Germany, Poland, Russia. It's just on the border. It was always switching. So that there is a specific beer style called Grodzisk. And then we have the Lichtenhainer and other ones you find in the books, but they are not available anymore. So that's the historical part. And then we have these categories of wheat beers, which is what is Germany more or less also famous for. And that all started with also a brown version. So if you go to a rural brewery in the Bavarian countryside and you ask them for their wheat beer, you will always get quite brown, dark amber beer with a little caramel, a little nutty note, and also a lot of fruity banana, maybe some clove notes. So the typical notes of wheat beers all together in one. High drinkability, very nice balance between bitterness and sweetness and all, and a very nice beer and beer style and beer idea. And then in the 19th century, it was possible to make modern malts on the continent. So this is quite an important time. So we are talking about the time around 1850, because before malting was not much developed on the continent. So in the end, you more or less only had the possibility to do quite brownish beers, or it was quite an effort to do more pale ones. And in Great Britain and the UK, they were leading and they were in front of, let's say, 200 years ahead of the continental development, and they already had modern maltings. And there was a journey of German brewers, an Austrian brewer, a Bavarian brewer, and a Franconian brewer, and they went to the UK and they discovered what they are doing there. They made espionage, they had special devices, and they brought these ideas back to the continent. And around 1800, everything changed on the continent. And so we could do modern malts, we could do pale malts, we could do darker malts. The names of these malts are Munich malt for the darker version, Vienna malt for the brown version, and Pilsner malt for the pale version, which are our three base malts in the German beer culture. And as soon as you have these malts, then you can also make different versions, especially of the wheat beer. And so it spread from the brownish original to a pale line of just a regular wheat and a dark line of a dark wheat, dunkles Weizen. Dark wheat beer, more roasty, more chocolatey, even coffee aromas, much more intense on the roasty side than the mother beer, this one here. So that was the other part. And if you do those beers stronger, so if you use more grains and also, of course, a little bit more hops, then you end up with stronger beers, and we call those bock beers. So we have a heller Weizenbock, so pale wheat bock, and even double bock. And the same thing in the dark area. There is a dark wheat bock and a dark wheat double bock. So those beers really get strange, and that's more or less the thing. So you have an idea of this beer, you make a pale wheat beer. If you make it stronger, you end up with a bock, and if you make it even stronger, you end up with a double bock. So that's the more or less the way they do it. And in between are just two ones which I couldn't really put in the chart because they are special. You have the Festweizen, which means a festivity beer, and that was simply the same thing as their regular wheat beer, but they made it a little bit stronger. So if you're talking about Plato, the grain bill, Stammwürze in German, then we original gravity, that's the right word. Then we are at around 12 with a regular beer and around 16 with a bock beer and 18 with a double bock. And these fest beers are around 13, 13.5. So just a little stronger than the regular ones. And the last thing here is the Eisbock. You can turn any beer in an Eisbock, just freeze it. And mostly you can do it with wheat beer. You normally use already quite strong base beers like double bocks, because if you have more alcohol in the base, then you get even more alcohol in the end. So Eisbock is a very special part of that. All right, so that was a lot of words, but in general, if you're talking about the German ales, you have the old ones, which came from the historical brown ales, and four main ones, the altbier and the kölsch in the Rhine area, and then the two ones, Berliner Weisse and Leipziger Gose, which are special ones. And then you have the whole wheat beer category, turning from a brown standard beer into pale and dark. So that's more or less the whole family of the German wheats. So now the German ales. So now we can do a little dive into two of these beer styles, as I already said. And the first one is the Berliner Weisse. Maybe first, a question for you. Just write in the chat. Do you think if we are talking about Berliner Weisse and about Gose, do you consider them as sour beers? That would be interesting for me. So if you think of Berliner Weisse, if you think at Gose, is these for you a sour beer? So Rob already said yes. Okay. We have yeses and nos, and also yes and no. Very interesting. Oh, some of you never had, so that's the best thing. Come to Germany to experience them. Okay. Julia says moderate. Perfect. Yeah. And that's Doug maybe made the point. So the Berliner Weisse in Canada are quite sour. That's the story behind, because there is an idea of these beers, and they are reproduced all over the world. And most of these breweries really make them very sour and very extreme. And if you look at the basics, they are not really. Of course, there is some tartness, but not what you experience in many of the craft breweries worldwide. So let's have a look at the Berliner Weisse first. So if we are in Berlin, so you see the Brandenburg Gate to the right, and Berlin itself as a city was not so old, or is not so old. So they started around the 13th century, and what they made is they started with wheat beers. They had quite a fertile soil. So the idea was, when they started, there was wood everywhere. It was a forest. But at the same time, we had this trade cooperation called Hanse, a lot of cities in the northeast of Germany, and they all were exporting a lot of goods from Germany, also a lot of beer, and they needed ships. They built ships all around, and so they needed wood. So there was a big demand of wood, and all these trees around Berlin were cut down, and then they had to do something else, and they started to try what is growing there grain-wise, and found out, okay, rye is working, and also barley, and also wheat, and so they started growing the grains, and of course, then they also started brewing, and they had all of them. So there was wheat beer, there was also red and brown beers they made out of barley. And talking about acidity in general, no, not only Germany, wherever you have been at this time, most of the beers had a little tartness. And if we compare it what we know today, we are on the level of sourness as we have it in white wines. But no one would say, a regular white wine would say this is a sour wine, because this is just the level of acidity it has, and that is what nature does if you have a normal fermentation, not the perfect and clean way we have it today. So that was the amount of tartness in all of these beers. The Berlin city was not so big. There was a neighboring city called Cologne, New Cologne. They are together. But then came the period where the Huguenots have been pulled out of France, and Prussia was a country, they just had lost the war. They had a lot of struggle. The famine and plague came to Berlin. They had a lot of population loss. So they needed people, and so they more or less imported 20,000 Huguenots into Berlin. So more than half of the city was a Huguenot city then. And they brought their ideas of drinking and also of culture with them. And right-wise, they only could do a few things, and one of the few things they were allowed was brewing. So many of them started to brew beer, and what they brewed was this white champagne wheat beer, and they also started to distinguish that from the regular brown beer, which was also still available in the city. What we know today is that this was a mixed culture of um, ale yeast, specific ale yeast range, but also a lot of microorganisms, even like Brettanomyces and also Lactobacillus and others, Pediococcus, around 10 different microorganisms that were working together, building that specific beer. The beer was not boiled through the process. So after mashing in, they just cooled it down. So it was never boiled. So it was the best ground for these microorganisms to develop. And also most of the devices, even the barrels and everything was made out of wood. And this wood was, of course, a perfect host for all of these microorganisms. So in all of the breweries, there was a specific culture or a mix of cultures living there. And they were also exchanging wort. Sometimes they even bought wort from other breweries. And so it was also a nice transfer of all these microorganisms throughout the breweries. In the end, we had this idea of a slightly sour, very refreshing, low alcohol, very thirst quenching drink, Berliner Weisse, and that was a big star in the area. Around 1800, they had about 300 breweries there, and but then it went down and down with the upcoming of the Bavarian style lager breweries, and after World War II, we only had 14 of these specific Berliner Weisse breweries left. And still, they were dying, and there was a time between 1980, 1985, where almost no real Berliner Weisse was available anymore. And now we had some modern brewers recreating the idea, studying, making a lot of research on it, also yeast labs propagating specific strains, also these mixtures. And at least one brewery is left at the moment in Berlin, which does the real stuff. So I have some pictures for you. This is an old picture from a Berlin beer garden around 1900. So what we definitely see is the way they are drinking. And what I always think is really astonishing is these glasses. So you see it here, or you see it here standing on the table. So we call that a Klauen glass. So it's quite wide and not so high and quite big. So around 700 milliliter up to 1 liter is you can put in them. And what the people did is that they bought one of these glasses full of beer and then they shared. So they passed this glass around, and the guy or girl who had the last sip had to pay the next round. So that was always a little bit like a game. Here you see also some guy drinking out of these glasses. So really different. Also here we have a picture of the people working at the Landré brewery. This was also one of these Berliner Weisse breweries, and you already hear the sound from the name Landré. This was definitely a French origin Huguenot base, and you see the people, and you see again an interesting glass. So it's like a chalice, I would say. It's a really beautiful way of beer glass. And of course, you see a lot of proud guys working in that brewery. So there's a lot of history behind that. We cannot cover this today, but in general, if you want to go more deep into that, you get more. Yes, I just see the question in the chat about the spanning of the Berliner Weisse glass. I just write it in the chat. Here we go. So, and and the next picture you see a little bit more of these glasses. So these are two from my personal collection. They are from the 18th century, the right one, and from the early 19th, the left one. Very impressive, thick, big glasses. And we tried Berliner Weisse out of them, and it's really great. It's big fun. Here you see more glasses used at this time, and all those in the middle were used for Berliner Weisse. So that's really interesting to see about the glassware. And if we're talking about the last brewery really making Berliner Weisse in Berlin, so if you ever get there, go to Lemke Brewery. They are at Hackischer Markt, right at Alexanderplatz, so in the center. And there you will get the last real Berliner Weisse. Of course, you get a lot of other versions also throughout Berlin, but they are all made just with lactobacillus, so just kettle sour, not with all the microorganisms and the complex idea of the beer. So this you will unfortunately only get at Lemke at the moment. Maybe we get better. Yes, Rob just wrote it in the chat. Schneeeule Ulrike is a good friend of mine. She stopped brewing last year, unfortunately. That was the other one. So now we only have Lemke. But you never say never. Maybe Ulrike comes back. We are all looking forward to that. All right, so that's for Berliner Weisse. Now a little look at Gose. That's the other beer style, which is associated to be a sour beer, but again, it's not. You have to imagine both of these beers, Berliner Weisse and Gose, were made to be drunk in large amount in the summer in the beer gardens. Hundreds, thousands of people sitting there enjoying beer after beer, and you could never do that if you have a strongly sour, very extreme beer. That only works if you have a balanced, nice one. And so also Gose was never intended to be a sour beer, what we have a lot of examples today. So if we are looking at Gose, the name is very easily to explain because there is a river called Gose. It's more or less in the center of Germany. So to the right, you see a little map. At the north, you see Denmark. And then if you go a little bit more south, you go to Goslar. Here is the city of Hamburg, for example. And if you look to Berlin, that's on that side. So we are just so Berlin is here. So we are just in that triangle. So here is Goslar. To be honest, it's more or less in the middle of nowhere. That's why not many people get there. But if you have the chance, please do. And and this is along the river of Gose, and they were quite a rich city. They belonged to that trade association I was already mentioning, the Hanse, and they had a problem because they had all their money from mining and from logging, and they started going on war and they lost. And with the loss of the war, they lost their logging and their mining rights, and the only thing they could do then was brewing beer. And so they started that, and the whole city turned into a huge brewery. And they also started exporting that beer. The only problem is if you see where Goslar is, again here, and Hanse export means you have to go to the harbors, to Hamburg or to Lübeck, here up there. Um, and that means quite a long way to get there with all your beer. And normally a normal beer would spoil, so you have to make it stronger that it survives, or you have to make special treatments or other things which make the beer longer lasting and better. And what they did is that they decided, okay, we have special spices in the Hanse, two of them, salt and coriander, we will use in our beers. And that's what they did. So they turned it a little salty and a little coriandery. So this nice coriander um, spicy flavor is because of coriander, the use of coriander, and that made it special, and that also justified the higher price you had because of the long transport or long export way for these beers. So it was quite successful, was exported even to Belgium, but also to the east. And here you see the city of Leipzig. And that was maybe the most successful export because when they exported from Goslar to Leipzig, the people there loved the beer. And so today, Leipzig is more known for Gose than Goslar, the origin itself. And also there's a little difference because on the way from Goslar to Leipzig, the beer got way more sour than on the original place just because of the time. And so the experience of the Leipzig people was quite more sour beer. So what they reproduced when they started brewing it themselves was more sour than the origin in Goslar. So that's also a little bit interesting. If you go there, then you can have a try and taste these beers. So also some pictures. This is the brewery in Goslar. It's reactivated. They were closed down until the 90s and then they restarted. That's the brewer, Odin Paul. A very nice guy, and they make also different versions of the Gose there, silver Gose, and also strong versions like Bock beer and these things. So try. And some pictures also here from old paintings here on coasters of the one of the Gose places, and you also see again how it was drunk, how was the culture, people sitting here in the beer gardens, for example, having a lot of these Goses. And if you go to Leipzig, this is Matthias Richter, he is the brewmaster there. As I said, it's a little more sour there. It's also beautiful culture, and they also have these beautiful bottles. But the same is also in Goslar. The historic bottles were always like this. And the idea was there was no cork in it. So you put the beer in it, and it was filled like up to here. And on the top was, of course, the microorganisms, the yeast, and everything. And that dried out and made a natural sealing in the bottle. And so that was how it was served and sold throughout the years. So far about Gose. So that's another very interesting um, beer style and a lot of misunderstandings. So Gose is not very sour. It is not very salty. It's normally a very drinkable, very, very nice beer to drink. So now we go into the lagers. So more beers from Germany and maybe those who are or we are best known for. Because at the moment, my impression is the whole world is turning back into lagers, more or less. So when I went to the States the last time, there was different Helles and Pilsner and Dunkel and all these styles around. So more or less people like to drink that. And to be honest, if you look about most modern IPAs and pale ales brewed in the States, they all use lager yeast for it. They don't talk about it, but it is like that. So some call it then cold IPA, but even with the other ones, whatever. So we go to another nice charts where you also can have a little view on these German beer styles. Same idea again. On the left, we have the older styles, and to the right, we have the modern world. Here it's much easier because the older styles, again, it's the old historic brown beer, which we call nowadays Keller beer because of storing it in the cellar. Keller, that's where the name comes from. And historically, there were only two of these beers, the regular beer, which they called Keller beer. This was brewed from September to March. And then it got warmer, and they had to stop brewing at the end of April. And what they made is they made a stronger version for better shelf life during the hot summer days. And that they brewed in March, which is März in German, and that's why they called it Märzen. So Märzen is nothing else than the stronger version of the Keller beer. And Keller beer also is not fixed. So there is pale Keller beer and dark and amber. It can be more or less hoppy and more or less carbonated, whatever. There's a lot of different ideas behind it, and the same is for Märzen. So there is not a single Märzen idea. It's always depending on where it's coming from, what is the base Keller beer style behind that Märzen. And there are other older beer styles like Rotbier, Zeugel, and Steinbier, which is even going back to the ancient days, but we can talk about that maybe later. Also, interesting story. So that's the historic part. And when we had then modern maltings, I already said it, when we had the ales, when we had Pilsner malt, Vienna malt, and Munich malt, then we could make different beers again. And so the most famous ones are the pale ones. Maybe Pilsner is the most famous one. We will talk about that in a moment. And the other version is Helles, which is not as hoppy as the Pils, but in the rest it's more or less the same. And the Helles category more or less is also referred to the Austrian Märzen. There's a lot of story behind that. Not today, maybe another webinar. And the Oktoberfest beer, which is also linked to Helles. And again, if you make Helles a little stronger, if you use more malt, more hops, but use the same idea, then you end up with an export. And if you do that stronger, you end up with a Bock. And if you do that stronger, you end up with a double Bock. So that's always quite easy. Just make it stronger, then you end up with the next level of Helles, for example. And the same is for the dark side. So we have Dunkles, which is the Munich Dunkel, for example, quite nice, dark, very roasty, chocolatey, maybe even some coffee aromas, a little bit like the dark ales. So these notes, and same thing, if you make that stronger, you have a dark export or a dark Bock or a dark double Bock. So you have always more intensity if you put more malts into it. And a little side way of Dunkel is Schwarzbier. That's always hard to guess because if you go to the country, they mix it always up. So there are, if you look for this at the style guides, There are a lot of Schwarzbiers they call Dunkel, and a lot of Dunkels they call Schwarzbier. So you will never get the right thing, probably. Whatever, it's hard to distinguish, but they are close together. Also, maybe something for another webinar. And again, we have Festbier and Eisbock as special versions of all of these beers, which are possible. And last thing here is the Vienna Lager, which is an Austrian beer style, but this is the pure Vienna malt beer, which has its own dot here. It died out in Austria, to be honest. It survived a little bit in Mexico and Texas, and then it came back, and nowadays they brew it again in Austria in a modern version. Also, quite an interesting beer style, very drinkable too. So, and as I promised, we also go a little bit deeper into those.
Marcus,
First, oh yes.
if you don't mind popping back to that previous chart, because Doug Greener in the chat has brought up a point that was also on my mind, and I think a lot of the audience will be interested to have you untangle. Because on this chart here, you have Oktoberfest beer growing out of the Helles or linked to the Helles. And when we look at the BJCP interpretations in North America, the Oktoberfest is often linked to the Märzen. Do you have any comments on that? We usually consider Oktoberfest slash Märzen as a style in the BJCP.
Yes. Yeah, but to be honest, at least historically, that's not right. Because if you look to the original Oktoberfest beer, so Oktoberfest now is more than 200 years old, and Helles, we will learn in a moment, is about 120 years old or something like that. So the original Oktoberfest beer was there before there was Helles, and at this time they drank Märzen because Oktoberfest is in the October in the September time, to be honest. And as I said, we were not brewing throughout the summer, so they were drinking the beer which was last brewed before, and that was Märzen. So they brewed the regular beer in Munich, then they brewed the Märzen in March and April, then they stored it through the summer, and for the festival they pulled out the Märzen. And that was the regular beer. And until 2 years ago, Hacker Pschorr was the last brewery in Munich serving the original Oktoberfest Märzen, and that was a brown or more or less dark beer, stronger version of a regular typical Munich beer. And when Helles got on the place, we will talk about that in a moment, then the whole Munich beer scene changed, and the breweries at the end of the 19th century decided immediately that they will serve this new beer at the Oktoberfest, and in a stronger version than the regular one, and that was then called the Oktoberfest beer. But this was never called Märzen. So Märzen was the old style, and from 1895, 96, it turned slightly into that pale version, what we have today. And this is more like an export. So normally you would not link it to Märzen, because Märzen, as it is an historic beer style, it is unfiltered, it is unpasteurized, it's less carbonated, and so totally different from what you have in a modern Oktoberfest beer. So historically, but as I already said, people are mixing up a lot of things, and you see it here. The best example is the Austrian Märzen. They sell more or less something like a Helles, but they call it Märzen out of historical reasons, because they knew in mind Märzen was always something special. And when they restarted brewing after the wars, they wanted to have a special name for their beer, so they remembered the old name and called it Märzen. And so it's an old term for a new beer, which means something totally different, but sounds old. So that's also a lot of marketing behind. But to be honest, if you think style-wise, modern Oktoberfest beer has nothing to do with the classic Märzen. So
Thanks, Marcus. I think that was
yeah.
on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah. Yeah, it is confusing. And I also see the Rauchbier question. We will come to that in a moment. So, yeah, I wanted to show you just a 1 minute film from the old time where you see what changed all the lager brewing. That was the invention of the ice machine, of making artificial ice. So what you will see is how they produced the ice, and they made they had an ammoniac bath where they put water in metal devices in it, and then it came out as a huge pile of ice. So you will see it now in a moment here.
Die Dampfmaschinen der Brauerei liefern auch Energie für die Kälteproduktion zur Kühlung des Biers.
So don't care about the words, it's
Noch
just the
früher konnte man Bier nur kühlen, indem das Eis aus dem Winter in Kellern aufbewahrt wurde. Die Humser Brauerei besitzt aber schon vor 1890 eine Linde-Kältemaschine.
So there was water in this thing and now it's ice. And we are in the year 1890.
Sie produzierte täglich 160 Tonnen Eis.
So and every day they made 160 tons of these ice piles, and they used it for storing their beer, for the cold fermentation, but they were also selling the beer throughout the cities. In this example, it's from Nuremberg, and people had the first versions of fridges, which means a wooden box with a space in the back for one of these icicles, and then they put them in and had it like 2 days, and then they had to buy a new one. So breweries were not only delivering drinks, they were also delivering ice. So yes, and behind that development, we have famous beer styles like the pilsner. And just to have a quick view, because nowadays more or less is a Czech beer style, but when it started, we are in the year 1842. That was part of Austria-Hungary and more or less the German area of culture. Founders there was a consortium, a group of people from the city of Pilsen. Most of them were Czech, and they built this beautiful brew house where you see the entrance tower here still in Pilsen. So if you ever have the chance, go there and see that. And what happened after those beers they made in Pilsen, maybe a quick word on it because we are a little bit running out of time, but they had a quite shitty wheat beer before. And then they decided we want to have a great beer. And so they went for looking where is good beer, and they found Bavaria. And then they said, okay, let's build a Bavarian brew house. They made that. And then they needed a brewer, so they made, said a headhunter bringing someone for brewing. That was a Bavarian brewmaster, and he probably brought the yeast and his ideas to Pilsen. There he found the beautiful water and especially the beautiful hops there, and he could brew a very new beer. And the secret behind Pils is not only the beer itself, the secret is that at the same time, people could afford to drink beer out of glasses. So before they had mugs, wooden mugs, metal mugs, clay mugs, whatever. So they never could see what they were drinking. And now we start to have glassware, and now they see what they are drinking. And that was maybe the biggest difference. If they had their regular beer, it was like a brown, muddy thing. And then they had this new Pilsner, which was bright and clear and golden and beautiful. And that was at least a big part of the success story. And from Pilsen, it went everywhere in the world. Brewers took it with them and started to brew the beer everywhere where it was possible. And that's the reason behind the second beer style I want to cover, but behind Helles. Because when this Pilsner beer arrived in the other cities, of course, there were brewers there. And they noticed, okay, there's a new beer coming, and people want that, and it is successful, and we have to do something. And in Munich, the brewers came together and said, okay, and we have to find a solution. And they had a long meeting, and afterwards it was like 6-5 voting that they decided, okay, we also do a pale beer. The only thing, they couldn't use as much hops because we have a different water situation in Munich. So it turned out to be looking like a Pilsner, but being much less hoppy. So at the end, it was Helles. And the funny thing is, they started brewing it in 1893, but they were not sure if it was possible to sell it to the regular Munich people. So they had the whole production, put it in a train, sent the whole train to Hamburg, sold it there, and had the feedback. And when they knew, okay, the beer sells, people are drinking it, the next year they started selling it in Munich. So first beer was served in Hamburg at 1894, and 1 year later they had it in Munich, and they immediately put it in the Oktoberfest. So at the right you see the presentation at the Oktoberfest in these times. So that is really interesting. And at that time also the idea of a pale Oktoberfest beer was born again, what we were just discussing a few seconds ago. And also to understand the development, here I have just two little charts, and it's from 1894, so the birth of the pale beer, until the 1960s. And you see the golden line, this is the output of pale beer, and the red line, which is the total output in general of beer. And so you see at the beginning, it was just a little share of the market. Most thing was here, everything else was brown, the old way. And then it started here, a first success story in the Roaring Twenties. So that was maybe a first heyday of the golden beer. And then after the wars, now we are here going there. What is today, as you saw, 50% and more. It's like the pale beer and Helles and Pilsner together. So that's the story behind. Also very interesting. A lot of things to talk. And also that not only happened in Munich. So when Pilsner arrived in Cologne, for example, they produced Kölsch as the answer, their answer to this new beer style. Or when it came to London, they started making a golden ale. Or when it came to the States, they started cream ale. So it's always, that was a big impact to have this new pale lager around the world. So two more beers to go, then we're done. First is Kellerbier. I wanted to mention that because, you know, I'm from Bamberg, which is right in the middle where Kellerbier comes from. It's a very old, very historic beer style. And so it's not really defined, because depending on where you go, which city, which place, it will look different, it will taste a bit different. The common ground is breweries are making that for hundreds of years, and they're selling a lot. So that's the idea, a beer that you can drink a lot, that matches with a typical food. And depending on your local source of grain, of water, of hops, it's more or less, it's more pale or more brown. It's more or less hoppy, and this is always different. So there's no clear definition of that. There's a lot of story behind lager yeast itself. We can't make that today anymore, but maybe that could be also interesting for another session, because modern lager yeast is something really new. And at this time, as I already mentioned, these beers were not clear lagers. They were always lagers and ales. And depending on where you are, what is the fermentation temperature, sometimes they were also ales. And still you have some breweries, especially in the south of Germany, they are producing ale Kellerbiers. So that's totally normal and no one complains. So that's just the historic tradition. And the last thing, we already had it in the chat, the question, where is the smoke beer in the chart? And same thing, there is no beer style smoked beer, but you can make any beer style, whatever beer style you have, and if you use smoked malt, then it will be a smoked beer. So this is the Bamberg selection you see here on the thing. It's not even everything, but it's a lot. And we have 3 breweries at the moment producing smoked beer in Bamberg. 2 of them making their own smoked malt, Schlenkerla and Spezial. And the beer you maybe all of you know is the classic Schlenkerla Märzen, which is... maybe I just forgot this one. It's here we go. This here, and but they also make a bock and a double bock and other versions out of that. So take care if you're talking about smoked beer. The common ground is smoke, and also really an amount of smoke. So not a hint of smoke, really smoky, and then it can be a wheat beer, it can be a Märzen, it can be a Dunkel, it can be pale. Whatever is the base beer style, you just use smoked malt with it. Yeah. So that was just maybe that background. This is the maltings, the original historical way of malting, and you always had a V-shaped chamber. At the bottom you had the fire. Through the fire you were putting wood, and of course wood has smoke. And on the top you had the grain, which was to dry, and that was drying in the smoky surroundings. So all the wood, all the mold was smoky, and it was an English guy, this one here, Nicholas Halls. He invented a non-smoking kiln in the UK, and there it started in the 17th century to stop to produce smoked malt. So they turned more and more into non-smoked beers, but it took time until 1800 until it came to the continent. So as I said, Britain was at least 100 years ahead, maybe 200, in many ways of industrialization and also stuff they were using for brewing. Yeah, so I think that's it. Otherwise, we don't have time for questions. Now I'm curious.
Amazing, Markus.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I think I might have been typing a little bit over you speaking there, but thank you everyone for watching and for your engagement. It was so fun to just watch the chat going along. There's going to be a feedback poll, which is going to come up in a moment on your screen. If you could take a moment to complete it, that would be great. And Markus, if you have time, I'd love to ask you the questions that are in the chat. There's 8 of them, but a lot of them are pretty quick.
Mhm.
Are you good for that?
Yeah, of course.
Amazing. So Manuel Hornman was asking, why is alt beer mostly perishable? And in brackets, he puts a month or so, fusion, etc., in contrast to other styles.
With perishable, you mean short shelf life?
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I wouldn't say it's especially short shelf life because in general, beer is something you should drink as fresh as possible. And if you go to the small breweries and you get their beer fresh, then normally the shelf life is maximum 1 or 2 months. And only if you go into industrial ways of brewing, then you have also more treatment of the beers, and then you get more shelf life. And there are big altbier breweries, so maybe the most famous is Frankenheim, for example. They are part of the Warsteiner group, so they produce a quite stable altbier. But if you go to the smaller ones, like Ürige, maybe the most famous one, I myself had a crate I bought, and 2 months later it was sour. So that happens. But that beer is a natural product, and you have to keep it like you would buy fresh milk. You would never put it for months in the sunshine or whatever. So try to keep it and try to drink it as fresh as possible. And the older beer styles are the more the shorter is the shelf life.
Mm. The next question was from someone named VS Kevin Smith. And for context, this popped up when you were on the ale slide with all of the different ales. And he's asking if Laureate, which I believe is a spring barley, if it's used for all the styles.
Mm, I'm not into all the different varieties of the spring barley. And what I know is that there are that we also have a development of grains in general for brewing. So that's very interesting because until the industrialization, they developed machinery for the grains they were growing. But then they had machinery and they were developing grains for the machinery to make the brewing better. And there are a lot of varieties, modern varieties of barleys and wheat and whatever, with the amount of proteins and everything. And now that goes back. So we had some historical grain varieties which are now planted again and grown again to be used also for historical beer styles. One important thing is these old varieties are much better in terms of the climate change effects. They don't need irrigation, don't need so much treatment, and so with the climate change going further and further, people go back to the old varieties because they were, in average, a better yield, even if the normal yield is lower. But if you go through 10 years, then you still have more with the old varieties.
Nice. The next question is more personal to you. It's from Sehi. Ooh, I'm not going to tackle that last name. It's a delightful last name. What 3 cities in Germany would you recommend to visit for best beers or most variety?
Hmm.
Ooh.
That's not easy. So definitely, I would always recommend Bamberg. Not only because the historical situation and then the smoke beer, because it's the only city where you get authentic smoke beer. Also in the surroundings, we have like 150 traditional breweries. So if you ever want to experience traditional lagers, Bamberg is the place to go to. The next one would definitely be the Rhine area. doesn't really matter if you stay in Cologne or in Düsseldorf because it's easy to commute between those two cities. But to have maybe one evening with all the kölsch and one evening with all the altbiers is definitely a great experience. And number three is hard. Maybe still Berlin. It lost a lot of breweries, but there are still like 25, and they have a bunch of everything. So you can experience a lot of different things. There are also more international beers and the German ideas of IPAs, which is definitely different to the real ones, whatever. So yeah, maybe that could be a nice trip, and you could do that easy by train.
Yeah, amazing. All right, next question. What type of hops is used in Bock and Doppelbock?
As I said, it depends on the base beer. Of course, we have the traditional German hop varieties, like the Hallertauer, all these classic varieties. Uh, but also on the other side, in the German lagers, the hop does not play this major role in terms of the aroma and the taste. It's more or less about the bitterness and a nice little addition by the hops. So they would never use aroma hops like the American ones with pineapple or extreme fruity or flowery aromas. More nice ones. I think that the most experimental ones are those like Sapphire. We have some bock beers with that, and they are quite hop aromatic. But the traditional bock beers is low in hop aroma. It's just it's more about the malty body, the balance, the drinkability, and that. And for that they use just the regular Hallertauer, Hersbrucker, Spalter, all these typical Tettnanger, these old landrace hops in Germany. Yeah.
So the next question is about the recent Helles tsunami, and mentioning that even traditional wheat beer breweries like Schneider and Erdinger are now brewing Helles, and just wondering if you have any insights or thoughts about that.
Yeah, that is the reaction to what happens on the market. So wheat beer was the star of like 10, 15 years ago. So we had breweries like Meisel here in close to Bamberg from Bayreuth. They were using every capacity they could get in Germany to produce more wheat beer. And then there was a sudden drop. So like it started, let's say 8, 9 years ago, and wheat beer dropped and Helles got higher and bigger and bigger, and now everybody turns into that. And historically, we have some wheat beer only breweries. The reason behind is that in the old times, there was a clear difference between lager brewing and ale brewing. And these lager breweries were always local and they had all the rights in the pubs. So if you opened a pub, it normally belonged to one of these breweries and they had the right to deliver their beer into the pub. And so you could never take any other lager than that one of your brewery. But these treaties never said anything about ales. So, and that was the big chance. If you were an ale brewery, you could deliver in any pub. And so that's why we have national wheat beer breweries like Meisel, like Schneider, like Erdinger, like Schöfferhofer, all these. But now they have a problem as the wheat beer demand is going down, and they need to sell something. And they see the new star now on the beer horizon. This is the Helles, and so they all now make a Helles, and most of them are quite good. And Schneider was one of the last, but I know that they were more than a year developing on the product to really bring a perfect one on the market. So that's also interesting.
Yeah, and that must have, I mean, they must have had to make some changes to their breweries to adapt to the.
Yeah, that's the thing that they simply, because they were big ones, so they simply bought other breweries or built other brewers. So for example, Meisel at the moment is building a whole new facility just for brewing Helles,
Mhm.
because it's not so easy to change the classic wheat beer production into the lager production. So they just buy a new, or in this thing they built a new brewery. But Erdinger, for example, or Schneider, they just bought new breweries or in existing breweries, and then they produce their lagers there.
Amazing. I just wanted to mention, I've noticed some people are posting questions in the chat. If you could pop them in the Q&A, that way we have them all in one place. That would be really helpful. Is Keller beer normally lagered much before being poured?
In general, yes. So there is the old rule, the historic rule, and that means for every degree Plato, so every percent, you store it for a week. So if you have a classic beer, normally it has 12 Plato. So it was 3 months in the cellar before it was sold or served. Nowadays it's a bit shorter, but if you go to the typical breweries here, you will never get a beer younger than 6 weeks. So it's normally, yes, definitely longer than if you go to the industrial breweries, which normally have about a week or something like that. And even they add on the time it's on the lorries, on delivering and whatever. So of course they want to earn money quick, and that's a different story.
Nice. Sticking with Keller beer, is Keller beer, if Keller beer is unpasteurized, what is the shelf life?
Yeah, as I said, I would say normally a month or
Okay.
6 weeks, or in a little bit, it depends on both things. How you, if you buy it fresh at the brewery, if you bring it home to your cellar and store it cool and in dark, then it maybe also survives half a year or a year. But it definitely changes. So that's the other thing. The best before date doesn't mean the beer is bad afterwards, but it's different. And so of course, you have the aging aromas of the malt, so it gets more into dried fruits and things like that, and the hop is reduced. All these things which we know. So it's maybe not as fresh as good anymore, but it's still drinkable. But normally we say drink the beer you need in the next week or maybe two. Buy the beer you need the next week, and then buy a fresh one again, because then you always have fresh beer. That's the best rule.
Or just go to the pub.
Or just go to the pub, yes.
Yes.
And for me, always the comparison with fresh milk is the same thing.
Yeah,
No one would have the idea to buy hundreds of liters of fresh milk and store it for half a year in the cellar before drinking it.
that's true.
Why do it with beer? No reason.
So we're at 9:06 and the questions are just piling in here, Marcus. Can you see the questions?
Mm, I see the normal chat, but not the
Uh,
Q&A chat.
all
But
right, then
maybe,
I
yeah.
will keep reading them to you and you just let me know when you're done. When you're done. So the next question is overall, the consumption of beer is flat or slowing down in Germany. Are people's tastes moving to other alcohols like wine or spirits, or are they less?
Now, it's in general, the most thing is they drink less alcohol. So it's not about going to wine. In fact, it's the other way around. Wine is even losing more, and a lot of people are switching from wine to beer. But maybe on the way to switch to non-alcoholic products anyway. So in general, the most thing is if you look at the young generations, so the people now between 18 and 28, almost 50% of them don't drink alcohol at the moment. And if you go one generation before, so between 14 and 18, in Germany, that would be okay for drinking. But there we have like 70% not drinking alcohol. So that is, if you look for the wider perspective, that means in the next 10, 15, 20 years, the breweries will lose much more customers for their alcoholic part. So they need to invent new drinks on the beer side, but also like kombuchas and things like that. And there's one main impact I'm always discussing with the breweries. At the moment, we always look for a replacement product. So you have like a pills, and then you make a non-alcoholic pills for
Mhm.
people who normally drink pills. But if you have this new target group, they never had an alcoholic pills, and they never have an idea of an alcoholic pills. They just want to have a nice drink. And that's a totally different target group. So as a brewery, you can develop a drink without being bent to a classic style or something like that. Just make what you can do best that makes a good drink. So that's a different challenge for the brewery. But the good thing is at a brewery we have fermentation. We have definitely something with less calories, no artificial colors, no artificial aromas, no added sugar, whatever. So this is always more healthy than a Coke or a juice mixed with water or whatever. So at the end, the potential is there. We just have to use it.
That is a really great insight because this phenomenon, of course, is happening worldwide. So, yeah, that's thanks for that. So the next question is just a curiosity.
Mhm.
We have someone asking, do Germans brew and drink much pale ale, IPA, or imperial IPA nowadays? What are your thoughts there?
The easy answer is no. It is, of course, it is there, and there are breweries making it. For example, Lemke in Berlin, I was already mentioning, they have nice versions of all the classic American and craft beer styles, but in general, it's not much around. So just because people had it a little bit in the craft beer times, but it was not very good communicated that time. So because many of the craft breweries went out to the market and said, your pills, your Helles, this is shit beer. You have to drink good beer, and this is only IPA. And that was definitely a wrong message to people drinking for centuries, the pilsners and all that stuff. And especially then, 5 years later, all these breweries discovered that they don't earn money with the IPA and started making Helles and pills. And then they said, okay, now we have the better pills or the better Helles, and that didn't really fit to the communication before. And so there was a lot of trouble behind that. So, but we have some good ones, but to be honest, also a really good IPA and pale ale has to have really fresh, good hops. And I never had better ones than, for example, in the Yakima Valley or at places where you really have these fresh hops. And that's maybe the biggest problem in Germany because it takes a while until our hop is harvested and processed and stored and sold. And so this really fresh beers, we don't have it like you have it, for example, in the States.
That is so interesting because it really IPAs have taken over in much of the world. So,
Mm.
but you're holding strong. Um, this is an interesting question. I'm going to do my best to pronounce it. Is Boxbeutel inspired by the Leipziger Gose bottle?
No. Boxbeutel is a wine bottle, and
Oh, okay.
this is a special wine bottle with a similar shape, but not the same long neck. And that is used only for Franconian wines, and it's also even protected there. And it's referring to an also medieval way of storing the wine, and the shape is a little bit like the best parts of a male goat, and that's why we call it the Boxbeutel. So that's the thing.
Interesting. This is a short question. Are any German ales boiled after mashing?
Yes, all of them nowadays. Just Berliner Weisse in a traditional way, no, but all of the other ones, yes. Yeah.
All right, let's maybe do one or two more and then we'll have to go. So someone here is wondering about oh, this is a can of worms. I was wondering about the history of the Reinheitsgebot. I read once that it was a way of preserving a Weizen monopoly for the king and less about purity. Is there any truth to that?
No, it's exactly like that. So the idea of protecting beer and of purity started in the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century. So that at the first time people mentioned this term, this idea. And before that, all these laws were just for financial reasons and protective reasons for the market, never for the product. So they didn't really care about purity in the way we think it today, to be honest. But I'm
Right.
no, I'm not against the purity law. It's a nice thing. It needs to be reformed maybe, but it's a great thing and it's our USP. But it's different.
Nice. Well, Marcus, you've answered a lot of questions and we really should wrap up. And I've answered as many as I could. Apologies if I'm typing here as
Maybe
well.
there's one I could shortly answer because that is an interesting one about the German beers and cans.
Okay.
Because that is a quite interesting story. It's quick, but we had a lot of cans until the end of the 20th century. And then with all the environmental laws, we started to ban cans for drinks, and there was a high amount of deposit which you had to pay on cans. So the cans almost disappeared totally out of the market. And so people from 2000 on never saw a beer can anymore. And then high price Prosecco brands started to using cans as their USP. So nice cans, small ones, high ones, beautiful ones. And there it didn't matter that it cost a lot. And so it came back as something for high value and special and very good drinks. And that's how young people learned what is a can. It's a thing for a good, a high price product. And then it started to come back into beer. And nowadays the advantage is big because of it's lighter, it's in the end it's cheaper, and we have now also ways for um, recycling. And so the can is really having a big comeback now. And also it's different. The can of the 90s and 80s always had a metallic taste. It was not a pleasant thing, but the modern cans are beautiful. So I always say it's the best thing for beer if you don't drink it out of the can. So you have to use a proper glass. But for storing it, for sending it, for selling it, it's the perfect. device, whatever. Container.
Nice. And there's one last question I want to finish on here in the Q&A, and that is, what's on your collar, Markus?
Oh,
The
here.
collar of your shirt. Yeah.
Ah, yeah, that's the that's the logo of the Beer Academy. So just my company, which I also have on the top left of me here. That's the Beer Academy. That's my company. I founded here in Bamberg. So if you want, in addition maybe to the WSET education, you can also become a beer sommelier, and that you can do, or a beer judge that you can do at the Beer Academy.
Well, Markus, I can't thank you enough for sharing your knowledge and passion with us. That was really great. And I still see the questions pouring in. Clearly, everyone's really engaged. For myself, I have to say, I had never seen those big Berliner Weisse glasses before. What are they called?
Klauenglas. Klauenglas.
Lauenglas.
Klauenglas. Not
I'm
so
just
easy.
still reeling at the idea of everyone passing it around and like strategizing so you don't have to have the last sip.
Hmm.
Wow, that's really something. Anyway, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for listening. The recording of the session will be mailed to everyone, and it will also be available to watch on the WSET Global channel on YouTube, where you can catch up on all of our previous webinars and events. And that includes 2 videos that Markus and I did together on pronouncing German beer styles and pronouncing German glassware. They're really fun, so check them out. And we also have another Explorer webinar next month on US beers with Jeff Allworth, and there's a link in the chat if you'd like to register to that. So if you'd like to find out more and sign up for our beer qualifications, you can visit our Where to Study page at wsetglobal.com. Thank you so much, Markus, and thanks everyone. This was really
Thank you.